Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into one of the most glittering traps in history. The Byzantine Imperial Palace. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into today's journey together. Imagine you're a young noblewoman in the Byzantine Empire enjoying a relatively peaceful life. You worry about family obligations. You worry about marriage prospects. You worry about whether your mother approves of your embroidery. Normal concerns. Then one day, someone arrives with astonishing news. The emperor might be looking for a wife. And somehow, your name has appeared on the list. Congratulations. You have just become a contestant in what may be history's most stressful lottery. At first, this sounds wonderful. After all, who wouldn't want to become empress? You would live in Constantinople, the greatest city in medieval Europe. Its massive walls protected hundreds of thousands of people. Its markets overflowed with goods from 3 continents. Its churches glittered with gold mosaics that made visitors wonder whether they had accidentally wandered into heaven. And at the center of it all stood the imperial palace. If everything went well, you might live there. If everything went poorly, you might also live there. That was part of the problem. From a distance, becoming empress looked like a fairy tale. Silk dresses, jeweled crowns, banquets, servants, magnificent ceremonies. Up close, it looked more like accepting a job where every coworker might secretly be plotting against you. The Byzantine Empire inherited the traditions of ancient Rome, and its rulers took ceremony very seriously. The emperor was considered God's chosen ruler on earth. As his wife, you would become the most important woman in the empire. That sounds impressive until you realize that every important person in the empire suddenly develops a keen interest in your business. Nobles watch you. Priests watch you. Foreign ambassadors watch you. Members of your husband's family watch you. Servants watch you. At some point, even the palace cat probably has political opinions about you. Nothing you do escapes attention. Wear the wrong clothing and people talk. Support the wrong court faction and people talk. Fail to produce an heir and people talk. Produce an heir and people talk even more. The ideal Byzantine empress was expected to be beautiful, intelligent, humble, pious, charitable, politically useful, endlessly patient, and capable of navigating one of the most complicated courts in world history. In other words, the empire was searching for a woman who did not actually exist. And the pressure never stopped. You were expected to smile during ceremonies that lasted for hours. You were expected to remember complicated court etiquette. You were expected to support your husband publicly, even when he was making decisions that seemed determined to create fresh disasters, which, to be fair, some emperors treated almost like a hobby. The most dangerous part was that success often attracted enemies. The more influence you gained, the more people wanted to undermine you. The more popular you became, the more rivals you created. And the more power you accumulated, the more dangerous your position became. The crown glittered beautifully beneath the palace lights, but hidden among the pearls and gold was an uncomfortable truth. In Byzantium, becoming empress was not the happy ending. It beginning of the problem. Now that you've discovered becoming empress is far less glamorous than advertised, you still have one major obstacle ahead of you. Actually becoming empress. And in Byzantium, that process could be surprisingly strange. Imagine receiving an imperial summons ordering you to travel to Constantinople. Nobody tells you exactly why. Your family suddenly becomes excited. Your mother starts inspecting your wardrobe. Your father begins acting unusually polite. Relatives you've never met suddenly appear and offer advice. This is generally a bad sign. Before long you learn the truth. The emperor needs a wife and you are one of the candidates. Welcome to the Byzantine bride show. Yes, this was a real thing. Several emperors selected wives through elaborate competitions that gathered unmarried noble women from across the empire. Officials would evaluate candidates and determine who possessed the qualities necessary to become empress. In theory, this allowed the emperor to choose the most suitable bride. In practice, it must have felt like participating in the world's most intimidating job interview. The stakes were slightly higher than most interviews, however. If you failed, you went home. If you succeeded, you became one of the most powerful women on earth. No pressure. The exact details varied from case to case, and historians still debate how some of these bride shows operated. But surviving accounts suggest that beauty, family background, intelligence, manners, and political usefulness all played important roles. You couldn't simply look impressive. You had to look impressive while representing a family that wouldn't create future headaches for the emperor. Unfortunately, nearly every noble family specialized in creating future headaches. The most famous example involved the future Empress Theodora, although her path to power was far more unusual than most. Others came from respected aristocratic families and entered palace life through more traditional routes. Regardless of background, every woman faced the same reality. The moment you entered the imperial court, your life stopped belonging entirely to you. Marriage was no longer a personal matter. It was state business. Your future children might become emperors. Your relatives might gain influence. Your friendships might affect policy. Even your personality could have political consequences. Imagine being judged not only on whether people liked you, but on whether your grandchildren might someday start a civil war. That was essentially the level of planning involved. And if you were chosen, your reward was immediate entry into a world of unimaginable wealth, a world filled with silk, gold, power, and prestige. Unfortunately, it was also filled with ambitious courtiers who had been playing palace politics long before you arrived. And unlike you, they already knew all the rules. At last, you've been chosen. Out of all the candidates, the emperor has selected you. The ceremonies are completed. The marriage has taken place. Crowds cheer as you appear in public wearing magnificent silk robes embroidered with gold thread. For a brief moment, everything feels like a dream. Then you move into the great palace of Constantinople. And the dream becomes considerably more complicated. The great palace was not simply a palace. It was practically a city hidden inside another city. Built over centuries, it stretched across enormous sections of Constantinople overlooking the Sea of Marmara. It contained reception halls, chapels, gardens, courtyards, private apartments, audience chambers, libraries, workshops, barracks, and enough corridors to confuse even people who worked there. You could probably get lost walking to breakfast. In fact, you might get lost several times before lunch. Every room seemed designed to impress. Walls shimmered with mosaics made from gold and colored glass. Marble columns arrived from distant provinces. Massive chandeliers reflected light across polished floors. Foreign visitors often described the palace with a sense of disbelief. The emperor wanted ambassadors to feel overwhelmed. And it worked. But while visitors saw splendor, you quickly discover something else. The palace is full of people. An incredible number of people. Servants, officials, guards, secretaries, priests, eunuchs, nobles, messengers, attendants, relatives, more relatives, and several people whose purpose seems to be standing in hallways looking important. The palace never truly sleeps. Someone is always moving through its corridors. Someone is always carrying information. And someone is almost certainly discussing you. As empress, your daily life becomes surprisingly public. You cannot simply wander wherever you want. You cannot always speak freely. You cannot assume conversations remain private. Every appearance is carefully planned. Every ceremony follows strict rules. Even where you stand during official events carries symbolic meaning. The Byzantine court loved ceremony the way some people love their favorite sports team. Except the rules were far more complicated. One mistake could cause embarrassment. Several mistakes could create political problems. And political problems in Byzantium had a tendency to grow into disasters. The greatest challenge, however, is learning whom to trust. Everyone smiles. Everyone bows. Everyone praises your wisdom. This sounds pleasant until you realize they may be doing exactly the same thing for your rivals. The palace is filled with competing factions, ambitious families, and individuals hoping to gain influence through proximity to power. You have entered a world where friendships are valuable, loyalty is uncertain, and gossip travels faster than imperial messengers. The golden ceilings remain beautiful. The gardens remain peaceful. The luxury remains extraordinary. But as you settle into your new home, an uncomfortable realization begins to form. You are no longer merely living in the palace. You are living inside the center of the empire's political battlefield. And before long, another challenge will arrive. Everyone will begin asking the same question. When will there be an heir? No sooner have you learned your way around the great palace than a new responsibility arrives. Actually, responsibility is the wrong word. Expectation is more accurate. Pressure is even more accurate. The entire empire now wants you to have a son. Not eventually. Not when you're ready. Soon as possible. For a Byzantine empress, producing an heir was one of the most important duties attached to the crown. The empire needed stability. Stability required a clear line of succession. And a clear line of succession usually meant a healthy male heir. Simple enough in theory. History, unfortunately, rarely cooperated with theory. The moment your wedding celebrations end, people begin watching for signs of pregnancy. Courtiers speculate. Relatives speculate. Foreign ambassadors speculate. Even people you've never met seem eager to speculate. The future of the Roman Empire apparently depends upon your private life. No pressure. When an heir finally arrives, the celebrations can be enormous. Church bells ring. Public ceremonies are organized. Gifts flow through the palace. Citizens rejoice because the future appears secure. For about 5 minutes. Then people begin worrying about the next problem. Because one son might die young. Several sons might compete against one another. Brothers might become rivals. Uncles might challenge nephews. Generals might decide they would make excellent emperors. Byzantine history contains enough succession crises to fill an entire library. Sometimes having an heir solved problems. Sometimes it created entirely new ones. As empress, your position often depended heavily on your children. A successful mother of future emperors could gain enormous influence. She might act as regent. She might guide policy. She might become one of the most powerful individuals in the empire. But if your children lost favor, your fortunes could change quickly. Very quickly. The Byzantine court had an unfortunate habit of treating political success as temporary. One year you might be celebrated throughout Constantinople. A few years later, you could find yourself isolated because a rival faction gained the emperor's ear. Some empresses mastered these dangers brilliantly. Others did not. Meanwhile, your daily life continues beneath constant observation. Every public appearance is analyzed. Every rumor is discussed. Every interaction with powerful officials becomes potential political news. You begin to realize that being empress is less like living in a palace and more like performing on a stage where the audience never leaves. And if producing heirs creates pressure, it is nothing compared to the next challenge awaiting you. Because the palace contains something far more dangerous than succession problems. Other ambitious people. By the time you've adjusted to palace life, learned dozens of ceremonial rules, and survived endless questions about heirs, you might think the worst is over. Unfortunately, Byzantium has a surprise for you. Several surprises, actually. Most of them are disguised as friendly people. The great palace is filled with rivals. Some are obvious. Most are not. The dangerous ones rarely announce themselves. Nobody walks up and says, "Good morning, Your Majesty. I intend to destroy your influence and replace your supporters within 6 months." That would at least be honest. Instead, palace politics operates through whispers, alliances, favors, and carefully timed gossip. Everyone smiles. Everyone bows. Everyone claims loyalty. And everyone seems to be discussing everyone else. As empress, you quickly discover that every powerful family in Constantinople wants something. Some want prestigious positions. Some want military commands. Some want tax exemptions. Some simply want access to the emperor. You become valuable because you can help provide that access. Suddenly, people are bringing gifts, offering compliments, praising your wisdom, laughing a little too hard at jokes that are not particularly funny. If someone tells you that you possess the greatest political insight in the empire after meeting you for 3 minutes, caution is advised. They probably want something. One of the most influential groups within the palace consisted of the eunuchs. These officials often occupied key administrative positions and controlled access to important information. Many became trusted advisors, diplomats, and palace managers. Wise empresses learned quickly that understanding palace networks could be just as important as understanding government. Because information was power, and power attracted competition. The situation became even more complicated when members of the emperor's own family entered the picture. Mothers, brothers, sisters, cousins, uncles, aunts. The Byzantine imperial family occasionally resembled a collection of rival kingdoms forced to share the same dining table. Family dinners must have been fascinating. And by fascinating, we mean terrifying. History offers countless examples of relatives plotting against one another in pursuit of influence. An ambitious brother might view an heir as an obstacle. A powerful mother-in-law might resent an empress's growing authority. A cousin might believe the throne should belong to him instead. The possibilities were endless. So were the conspiracies. The difficult truth was that popularity could become dangerous. The more influence you gained, the more attention you attracted. The more attention you attracted, the more enemies appeared. And in Constantinople, enemies did not always attack openly. Sometimes they spread rumors. Sometimes they built alliances. Sometimes they simply waited. As you settle deeper into palace life, one lesson becomes impossible to ignore. The greatest threats to an empress rarely came from foreign armies beyond the city walls. They usually came from people standing much, much closer. If palace rivalries are the hidden danger of being empress, ceremonies are the visible one. And there are a lot of ceremonies. An almost unbelievable number of ceremonies. The Byzantine Empire loved ritual with a level of enthusiasm normally reserved for sports fans discussing championship games. Every movement had meaning. Every garment had meaning. Every seat had meaning. Every doorway had meaning. At some point you begin to suspect that even the curtains have official ceremonial duties. As empress, much of your life becomes a carefully choreographed performance. You attend religious festivals. You welcome foreign ambassadors. You participate in imperial processions. You appear at public celebrations. You accompany the emperor during important state occasions. And every one of these events follows rules that have been refined over centuries. Sometimes centuries of rules create a lot of rules. Visitors to Constantinople were often amazed by the spectacles. The imperial court seemed almost supernatural. Golden robes shimmered beneath candlelight. Choirs filled churches with music. Officials moved according to precise protocols. The emperor and empress appeared surrounded by an atmosphere of sacred authority. This was intentional. The empire wanted people to be impressed. It wanted ambassadors to return home convinced they had witnessed the greatest court on earth. It wanted subjects to see stability, order, and divine favor. What it did not want was the empress tripping over her robes in front of a foreign delegation. Unfortunately, that possibility always existed. The clothing alone could be challenging. Imperial garments were magnificent, but hardly designed for comfort. Heavy silk, embroidered decorations, jewels, and ceremonial crowns could transform a simple public appearance into an endurance test. Looking majestic for several hours sounds wonderful. Actually doing it is another matter. Meanwhile, every gesture is being observed. Did you greet a certain noble first? Did you spend too much time speaking with a particular official? Did you appear distracted during a religious ceremony? People notice. And people talk. They always talk. Even your facial expressions can become subjects of discussion. A smile might be interpreted as support. A frown might be interpreted as disapproval. A moment of boredom might somehow become a political scandal by the end of the week. The pressure is exhausting. Yet these ceremonies are not optional. They are essential to maintaining imperial authority. Every appearance reinforces the image of a powerful and stable empire. Which means you must continue smiling, standing, bowing, praying, and processing through endless halls while remaining perfectly dignified. No matter how tired you feel. No matter how uncomfortable your crown becomes, and no matter how badly you want to sit down. Because the moment you stop performing your role, people begin asking questions. And in Byzantium, questions had a dangerous habit of turning into rumors. That would soon become one of the greatest threats an empress could face. By now, you've learned how to survive ceremonies. You've learned how to navigate rivalries. You've learned that nearly everyone in the palace wants something. Unfortunately, there is one more lesson every Byzantine empress eventually discovers. Privacy is dead. Not mostly dead. Completely dead. The moment you become empress, your life ceases to belong entirely to you. Every action, every conversation, and every appearance becomes a matter of public interest. You are no longer just a person. You are an institution. And institutions do not get much alone time. The Great Palace may contain hundreds of rooms, but finding true privacy inside them is surprisingly difficult. Servants clean chambers, guards protect entrances, officials deliver messages, ladies-in-waiting accompany you throughout the day. Even when you are technically alone, you are rarely far from someone whose job involves observing you. Imagine trying to relax knowing that half the empire would love to know what you said during breakfast. That was essentially daily life. Foreign ambassadors reported on your behavior. Court officials reported on your behavior. Church leaders discussed your behavior. And ordinary citizens sometimes discussed your behavior, too. The people of Constantinople loved imperial gossip. Loved it. News spread through the city with astonishing speed. A disagreement in the palace could become common knowledge before sunset. A rumor whispered in one corridor might reach the markets by the following morning. Modern social media would have felt strangely familiar. Except the consequences were occasionally more severe. As empress, your reputation becomes one of your most valuable possessions. If people view you as charitable, pious, and wise, your influence grows. If people view you as arrogant, wasteful, or manipulative, enemies gain opportunities. And enemies are always searching for opportunities. The problem is that reputation often has little to do with reality. A rumor does not need to be true. It simply needs to be believed. One misunderstood comment can become a scandal. One public disagreement can become evidence of a political feud. One unfortunate coincidence can become proof of an imaginary conspiracy. Byzantine society was deeply political, and information was a weapon. The people who controlled stories often controlled power. This forced empresses to think carefully about everything they did. Every public appearance mattered. Every friendship mattered. Every statement mattered. It sounds exhausting, because it was exhausting. And just when you think life could not become more stressful, another challenge emerges. Because in Byzantium, politics was not the only thing capable of dividing an empire. Religion could be even more dangerous. If you've managed to survive palace politics, endless ceremonies, and constant scrutiny, you might assume you're becoming good at this whole empress business. You would be mistaken. Because now you've reached one of the most dangerous subjects in Byzantine life. Religion. Modern people often think of religion as a personal matter. The Byzantines did not. For them, religion was tied directly to government, law, politics, military victories, natural disasters, and the survival of the empire itself. If a drought struck the countryside, people might wonder whether God was displeased. If an army suffered defeat, people might debate whether the empire had strayed from true doctrine. If an earthquake damaged Constantinople, theological arguments could suddenly become very urgent. And somehow, as empress, you could find yourself caught in the middle of all of it. This was particularly dangerous because Byzantine Christians frequently disagreed about theology. And when Byzantines disagreed about theology, they did so with remarkable enthusiasm. A debate over the nature of Christ could divide cities. Arguments over icons could divide families. Disputes between church leaders could shake the entire empire. Imagine an argument so intense that it threatens national stability. The Byzantines considered that a normal Tuesday. As empress, your personal beliefs mattered a lot. Support the wrong bishop and powerful enemies appear. Favor the wrong religious faction and criticism spreads through the capital. Express the wrong opinion publicly and suddenly half the empire is discussing your theology. Many empresses discovered this firsthand. Some became patrons of religious movements. Others influenced church policy. A few found themselves at the center of controversies that lasted decades. One famous example involved the Great Iconoclast controversy. When the empire became deeply divided over the use of religious images, emperors, bishops, monks, soldiers, and ordinary citizens argued passionately over the issue. Some empresses supported icons. Others opposed them. Either choice guaranteed enemies. The difficult part was that there was rarely a safe position. Neutrality often looked like weakness. Choosing a side created opposition. And changing your mind created even more opposition. It was the political equivalent of trying to walk across a frozen lake while everyone around you argued about which direction was safest. Eventually, something was going to crack. The pressure could be immense. You were expected to defend the faith, support the emperor, maintain public respect, and somehow avoid becoming the focus of a theological firestorm. If you've made it this far as a Byzantine empress, congratulations. You have survived court politics. You have survived religious controversies. You have survived rumors. You have survived ambitious relatives. Now comes the truly exciting part. People trying to overthrow the government. One of the unfortunate realities of Byzantine history is that the throne often looked easier to obtain from the outside than it actually was. This observation inspired countless individuals to try anyway. Generals tried. Governors tried. Relatives tried. Former allies tried. Sometimes complete strangers looked at the emperor and thought, I could probably do that. History suggests they were often overconfident. Yet that rarely stopped them. For an empress, a coup was among the most terrifying events imaginable because it threatened everything at once. Your position, your family, your children, your wealth, your future, your life. All could disappear in a matter of days, or hours, or occasionally before lunch. The most famous example came during the reign of Justinian I in the year 632. The capital exploded into what became known as the Nika riots. What began as unrest between rival chariot racing factions quickly transformed into a full-scale rebellion. Large sections of Constantinople burned. Government buildings were destroyed. Thousands of angry citizens filled the streets. The rebels even proclaimed a new emperor. At one point, the situation became so desperate that Justinian reportedly considered fleeing the city. Which would have been understandable. Most people tend to leave when surrounded by riots and revolutionaries. But according to later accounts, Empress Theodora refused. She delivered one of the most famous speeches in Byzantine history, declaring that royal purple made an excellent burial shroud. In simpler terms, she preferred dying as empress to living as a fugitive. Comforting words for everyone involved. Fortunately for Justinian, her determination helped convince the government to stay and fight. The rebellion was eventually crushed. The throne survived. And Theodora's reputation became legendary. Unfortunately, not every empress was so lucky. Many discovered that when a coup succeeded, the victors rarely left the previous ruling family in place. Former emperors were often imprisoned, exiled, blinded, or forced into monasteries. Their wives frequently shared the same fate. The Byzantine Empire had a remarkable talent for turning yesterday's rulers into today's prisoners. One week you could be presiding over imperial ceremonies beneath golden mosaics. The next week you might be packing for exile. Assuming you were given time to pack. This uncertainty haunted palace life. Every rumor of rebellion created anxiety. Every military defeat raised questions. Every ambitious general became a potential threat. Because in Byzantium the throne was never completely secure. And sometimes the most dangerous enemy wasn't outside the palace. Sometimes he was already inside it. After surviving revolts, assassination plots, and political conspiracies, you might assume the greatest dangers in the Byzantine Empire involve armies. Armies are certainly dangerous. But armies have one major disadvantage. You can see them coming. Rumors are different. A rumor can enter the palace unnoticed, drift through a few conversations, pass between servants, officials, and nobles, and before long half of Constantinople believes something that never happened. And as empress, rumors are one of your worst enemies. Because no matter how powerful you become, you cannot arrest a whisper. The capital of Constantinople was one of the largest cities in the medieval world. Hundreds of thousands of people lived behind its famous walls. Merchants arrived from distant lands. Pilgrims filled the streets. Sailors crowded the harbors. And everyone loved gossip. The Byzantines may have built magnificent churches and preserved Roman civilization. But they also enjoyed discussing the private lives of important people with extraordinary enthusiasm. Particularly yours. If you appeared too close to a certain nobleman during a ceremony, people talked. If you argued with a church leader, people talked. If you stayed out of public view for a few weeks, people talked. If you appeared in public every day, people still talked. It was an impressively efficient system. Sometimes rumors were harmless. Most were not. A false story could damage your reputation. It could weaken political alliances. It could encourage rivals. It could even convince powerful figures that the emperor's family was losing support. And in Byzantium, perception often mattered almost as much as reality. Perhaps people begin claiming that you are secretly controlling the emperor. Perhaps they claim you favor one religious faction over another. Perhaps they insist that your family is planning to seize more power. None of these stories need evidence. They simply need listeners. And there were always listeners. Some empresses became legendary targets of gossip. Theodora, despite her intelligence and influence, inspired countless stories from both supporters and enemies. Centuries later, historians still argue about which accounts are true, and which were little more than political attacks disguised as history. That tells you everything you need to know. If scholars cannot agree after 1,000 years, imagine how confusing things were at the time. The cruelest part is that defending yourself often made matters worse. Deny a rumor too strongly, and people become suspicious. Ignore it, and people assume it must be true. You are trapped. And while rumors could destroy reputations, the next danger was even worse. Because eventually every Byzantine empress had to confront a terrifying possibility. What happens if you lose? Every Byzantine empress eventually lived with a quiet fear. Not the fear of invasion, not the fear of rebellion, not even the fear of assassination. The real fear was waking up one morning and discovering that your world had vanished overnight. Because in Byzantium, losing power rarely meant simply losing power. It meant losing everything. One day you might be seated beside the emperor beneath golden mosaics while officials bowed before you. The next day, those same officials might be bowing before somebody else. Political fortunes changed with astonishing speed in Constantinople. A failed military campaign, a palace conspiracy, a disputed succession, an unpopular policy. Any one of these could bring down an emperor. And when emperors fell, empresses usually fell with them. The Byzantine solution to this problem was surprisingly consistent. Send them to a monastery. The empire had an almost magical ability to solve political disputes by forcing people to become monks or nuns. Former emperors became monks, princes became monks, rivals became monks, and empresses frequently became nuns. One begins to suspect the monasteries of Byzantium were filled with people who had other career plans. Officially, entering a monastery was a religious act. Unofficially, it was often a very convenient way to remove someone from politics. Once inside, your opportunities to lead armies, organize rebellions, or reclaim the throne became significantly limited. At least that was the theory. Reality was often more complicated. Some exiled empresses continued influencing politics through letters, allies, and family connections. Others quietly accepted their fate and disappeared from public life. Many had little choice. Imagine spending years living in one of the most luxurious palaces on earth. You wear silk. You command servants. You participate in grand ceremonies. Then suddenly you find yourself in a modest monastery following strict religious routines. The adjustment must have been dramatic, to put it mildly. And monasteries were not the only destination. Some empresses were sent into exile far from Constantinople. Others were confined to estates. A few were imprisoned. The lucky ones retained some comfort. The unlucky ones discovered how quickly former friends disappeared because power attracts loyalty. Losing power reveals who was actually loyal. That lesson repeated itself throughout Byzantine history. The most tragic part was that many fallen empresses had done nothing wrong. They simply happened to be connected to the wrong emperor at the wrong time. When dynasties collapsed, innocence offered little protection. Political necessity usually mattered more. Yet despite these dangers, some remarkable women refused to accept defeat. Some fought their enemies. Some reclaimed power. And a few managed something even more extraordinary. They became stronger after losing everything. Not every Byzantine empress accepted defeat quietly. Some certainly did. Some entered monasteries, faded from public life, and spent their remaining years far from the center of power. But others looked at exile, political rivals, military threats, and hostile court factions, and essentially said, no. These women became some of the most remarkable figures in Byzantine history. Because surviving the Byzantine court required intelligence. Thriving in it required courage. And fighting back after losing everything required something close to stubbornness on a legendary scale. Take Empress Irene, for example. Originally arriving in Constantinople as a young bride, she eventually became one of the most powerful rulers the empire had ever seen. After the death of her husband, Emperor Leo IV, she served as regent for her young son. Many people expected her influence to be temporary. Irene had other ideas. Over time, she maneuvered through court politics, neutralized rivals, and gradually consolidated power. Eventually, she became the sole ruler of the empire. Not empress beside an emperor. Not regent for an emperor. The ruler. In a world dominated by men, this was extraordinary. It was also controversial, very controversial. Her reign generated both admiration and criticism. But one thing was undeniable. Nobody could accuse Irene of being passive. Then there was Theodora, one of the most famous women in Byzantine history. After the death of her husband, Emperor Theophilos, she acted as regent for her son and helped restore the veneration of icons, ending one of the empire's most bitter religious disputes. For decades, emperors, bishops, soldiers, and citizens had argued over religious images. The conflict divided the empire. Theodora helped bring it to an end. Not bad for someone living in a society that often expected women to remain in the background. Again and again, Byzantine history produced women who refused to accept the limitations others placed upon them. Some negotiated, some plotted, some built alliances. Some outmaneuvered powerful generals and experienced politicians. A few even proved better rulers than the men around them. Which must have been particularly irritating for those men. Of course, fighting back carried enormous risks. Failure could mean exile, imprisonment, or political destruction. Success created enemies. Sometimes even more enemies than before. Yet these women continued anyway. Because after years spent navigating palace intrigue, religious disputes, conspiracies, and constant scrutiny, many empresses learned a valuable lesson. In Byzantium, survival often belonged not to the strongest person but to the most determined. And that raises the final question. After all the danger, stress, betrayals, and uncertainty, was being empress actually worth it at all? After everything you've endured, it is time to ask the obvious question. Was being a Byzantine empress actually worth it? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Of course it was. You lived in the richest city in Europe. You wore silk imported from distant lands. You attended ceremonies that dazzled foreign ambassadors. You had access to wealth that ordinary people could scarcely imagine. When you entered a room, nobles bowed. When you spoke, powerful men listened. When you traveled through Constantinople, crowds gathered to watch. That sounds like a remarkable life. And in many ways it was. The problem is that every privilege came attached to a cost. The palace was magnificent, but it was also a cage. The crown was beautiful, but it was also a burden. The influence was real. So were the dangers. While ordinary citizens worried about harvests, taxes, or local disputes, you worried about whether a military commander was planning a rebellion. While merchants worried about business, you worried about succession crises. While monks worried about their souls, you worried about political factions trying to destroy your reputation. Different problems, not necessarily better ones. In fact, some days you might have looked at a fisherman working peacefully along the Bosphorus and felt slightly jealous. At least nobody expected him to prevent a civil war before lunch. The greatest irony of all was that the women who seemed to possess everything often enjoyed the least security. A baker's wife might live a modest life, but she generally knew where she would sleep next month. An empress could not always say the same. One failed campaign, one palace conspiracy, one unpopular decision, one ambitious relative. That was sometimes all it took to bring an entire dynasty crashing down. And yet, despite the risks, many Byzantine empresses left an extraordinary legacy. They built churches. They sponsored charities. They influenced laws. They shaped religious policy. They guided emperors. Some ruled empires. Others saved them. Their achievements survived long after their enemies had vanished. Today, names like Theodora, Irene, Zoe, and Theodora the Younger remain famous because they were far more than decorative figures sitting beside a throne. They were political players in one of history's most complicated societies. So, was being empress worth it? Perhaps the answer depends on the person. If you enjoyed luxury, influence, prestige, and the chance to shape history, then maybe yes. If you preferred privacy, safety, peace of mind, and a reasonable work-life balance, then absolutely not. In the Byzantine Empire, becoming empress meant gaining the world. The challenge was keeping it. And more often than not, that proved to be the hardest part of all. And so, as our journey through the Byzantine palace comes to an end, you finally get to do something that many empresses desperately wish they could do. Take off the crown. Not because the ceremonies are over. Not because the empire is safe. But because carrying that crown every day was exhausting. Looking back, the life of a Byzantine empress was a strange contradiction. From the outside, it appeared to be the closest thing the medieval world had to a fairy tale. Gold-covered halls, silk robes, jeweled crowns, servants attending to every need, the admiration of millions, the power to influence the fate of an empire. It sounds wonderful until you remember that fairy tales rarely include tax revolts, palace coups, theological controversies, and relatives plotting against each other at dinner. Byzantine empresses lived at the center of one of history's most sophisticated civilizations. Constantinople stood as the greatest city in Europe for centuries. Its walls protected it from countless enemies. Its merchants connected continents. Its churches inspired awe throughout the Christian world. Yet, the women at the top of this magnificent society often paid a heavy personal price. Many lost children. Many lost husbands. Many lost their freedom. Some lost everything. A few lost their lives. And all of them lived under pressures that would have broken most people. What makes these women remarkable is not simply that they survived. It is that many of them managed to leave their mark on history despite the obstacles surrounding them. Theodora helped save a dynasty during its darkest moment. Irene became ruler in her own right. Zoe repeatedly fought her way back into power despite attempts to remove her. Theodora the Younger helped reshape the religious future of the empire. Again and again, Byzantine empresses demonstrated intelligence, resilience, and determination. Sometimes they were heroes. Sometimes they were villains. Often, they were a complicated mixture of both. But, they were never merely decorations beside the throne. They were active participants in the story of the empire. And perhaps that is the greatest lesson of all. The crown did not make these women powerful. Their ability to survive the crown did. So, the next time you see a glittering mosaic of a Byzantine empress dressed in gold and pearls, remember that you are not simply looking at a symbol of wealth. You are looking at someone who spent every day navigating one of the most dangerous political environments in human history. Which is why, despite all the luxury, prestige, and influence, being a Byzantine empress was probably not the dream job it appeared to be. It was, however, one of the most fascinating. The dangers of medieval travel begin the moment you leave home. Not when the bandits appear. Not when the storm arrives. Not when sickness strikes halfway through your journey. The real danger starts when the familiar world disappears behind you. It is dawn. A pale orange light spreads across the horizon as you stand at the edge of your village. Behind you are the thatched roofs, the fields you know by heart, and the people who have known you since childhood. Ahead lies a muddy road winding toward distant towns, forests, rivers, and countless unknowns. You adjust the strap of your travel bag and take one final look back. For most medieval people, this would be a strange sight. The vast majority never traveled far from where they were born. A peasant might spend an entire lifetime within a radius of 10 or 15 miles. Everything they needed was nearby. Family, work, church, and market. The world beyond that was often little more than rumor. A traveler returning from another region might describe towering cities, foreign languages, dangerous mountains, or strange customs. For many listeners, these stories sounded almost like fairy tales. Today, however, you are becoming one of those travelers. Perhaps you are a merchant carrying wool to a distant market. Perhaps a pilgrim heading toward a famous shrine. Maybe you are a messenger, a craftsman seeking work, or simply someone escaping hardship. Whatever your reason, you are stepping into a world with very few guarantees. There are no maps tucked into your pocket, no weather forecasts waiting on a glowing screen, no emergency services, no roadside hotels displaying vacancy signs. Even knowing where you are can become difficult. Many roads are little more than dirt tracks worn into the landscape over centuries. Signposts are rare. Local directions often sound suspiciously unhelpful. Follow the old oak tree. Which oak tree? The large one. The large? Excellent. That narrows it down to only several thousand possibilities.